Welcome everyone, and I'll let Vanessa, Santiago, Schwarz, and Elizabeth Silva introduce themselves, and we can get started with the session.
All right, let me share my screen and then I can start the introductions. Lucy, can I get a thumbs up if it looks okay? Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody. Elizabeth and I are going to introduce ourselves, but we're so excited to be here and to talk to you about addressing issues of special education among bilingual students. Just to give you a little bit introduction to who we are and what our history is. Elizabeth and I go way back. We actually met as undergrads in college in New York City. And we, in addition to attending college together, we got to student teach together our senior year of college. And then we got to be the two fourth grade dual language teachers at a public school where we had student taught. We worked there for a number of years together. We worked at another dual language school in New York City together. We co-taught in the same classroom. So one of us was the general education teacher and one of us was the special education teacher in a dual language two-way immersion program. Our kids didn't necessarily know who was who. And now we're both at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I'll let Elizabeth tell you about what she's doing, but I work with teacher candidates in the elementary teacher education program and support them in becoming culturally sustaining teachers for all students, but especially for their emerging bilingual students. So we're going to be drawing on a lot of our knowledge, both as former special education teachers and now in what we've learned through our studies in academia. So we're excited to talk. Now let Elizabeth, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Silva Diaz, and I wanted to add that we also co-taught some courses at Bank Street College together. So we taught teachers getting their master's in special education or bilingual education or their joint program. And I am a PhD candidate. I'm working on my dissertation right now, and I am using arts-based methods with upper elementary students that are dually identified as emerging bilinguals and also have a disability designation through an IEP or a 504. And we are exploring what their bilingualism looks like and what their languages practices look like, and really leveraging their knowledge and their expertise as learners so that we can inform how bilingual spaces can support students that are dually identified. So it's been really fun trying to do that now.
So today in our session together, we're going to go over some terminology that's important to have in your back pocket when we're discussing students who are bilingual learners in the context of special education. Then Elizabeth is going to present an overview of the challenges that we face with working and supporting this population of students, and also the context both locally and nationally, and some policies that are in place to safeguard against inequities for these students. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-tiered systems of support and what that looks like for emerging bilingual students. And I'll give you some practical examples of what that can look like in your classroom. And then also continue on with some more specific examples of what it means to be an inclusive, culturally sustaining teacher for emerging bilingual students. And we'll leave time for questions at the end. I'll let Elizabeth go.
Yeah, so today you'll be hearing us use the terms emerging bilingual, and we really like this definition as students who have the potential to develop multilingual abilities with support from home and or school. Typically in schools, these students are given the designation of English learner and the federal designation or of non-English proficient, NEP or LEP, right? Non-English proficient or limited English proficient. So we really want to shift that deficit framework to an asset-based framework and thinking about all the potential language practices that they do have inside them. You'll also see us say students with disabilities, and we purposefully use the slash to push against this binary between ability and disability. We want to acknowledge that disabilities are social constructions, right? They become like an issue, right, or a problem, depending on the context that we're in. But we also want to be mindful that there is human developmental variation. There are differences between us that do affect the way we interact in our world. So we have to acknowledge that duality of people's experiences. We are also centering the person and not the disability. And I want to acknowledge that some people that may have a disability like to own the term. So there are people who may want to be referred to as autistic. So what Vanessa and I typically do is we use person first language, but if an individual themselves says, I would prefer to be called autistic as opposed to a person with autism, then we honor that wish. So sort of laying the groundwork as an inclusive, right? We have our pronouns up for a reason and building that into our framework when we talk about students with disabilities, and also acknowledging their position and their own experiences. If you can click on the next slide. So that we could probably spend the whole hour just talking about the challenges, but we want to spend a few minutes here acknowledging that there are lots of different things that are in play when we're talking about students that are dually identified as emerging bilinguals and also students with disabilities. And the first thing that we want to acknowledge is that we often hear about the systemic racism in the criminal justice system, right? We are just celebrating 1 year of the death of Ahmaud Arbery, or even of the maternal death, right? Black women die in childbirth 4 times larger. This is also the disproportionate representation is an example of that. And they affect the way that the educational opportunities for certain culturally and linguistically diverse students. And I think it's important to remember the paradox of both bilingual education and special education and its history, right? For example, on the one hand, both bilingual education and special education were created to support students and address their specific learning needs. But at the same time, both when special education was first put in place and when bilingual education was put in place, it was used as a way to segregate Black and Brown students from their white monolingual mainstream peers. And so that history needs to be acknowledged, and our own biases living within a system of systemic racism also plays into this. The inequitable educational opportunities can be seen in lots of different ways, right? Once a student is given the label of both emerging bilingual and having a disability, they tend to be pulled out of bilingual programs. They tend to not receive both the needs that they are entitled to under law, right, as having an emerging bilingual designation and as having a specific learning disability. And actually in 2015, the Department of Justice and the Department of Education sent out a joint colleague letter specifically talking about this and addressing this to all districts across the United States because it was a real problem. Sometimes districts would hold back bilingual services and only give, or ESL services and only give special education services, or the other way around. They'd be like, let's wait and wait and wait. It's probably a language acquisition thing. We're not going to refer them to special education. So really of the need to have both of those things in the front of our mind. There's also really little consensus on the appropriate tools for assessment and ideal practices. The reality is that we don't have assessments that look at kids bilingually. We do have tests that come in translated versions, right? We might have a Spanish version of a test or English version or French Creole version of a test. But typically those are also still normed on monolingual speakers of that language, or they can be normed on bilingual speakers, but they may have a different variety of Spanish. Actually, there was a study done on the Woodcock-Munoz language survey revised, which is one of the assessments that is typically often used when kids are given the disability designations. And their results revealed that on the English subsets, displayed statistically and practically significantly different depending on whether the students spoke Mexican, Cuban, or were Puerto Rican bilingual children. So we need to keep those things in mind, that we're when we're talking about emerging bilinguals, it's not this one monolithic group. We have lots of different languages, lots of different cultures. Some students are growing up learning 2 languages throughout their life. And also some students may have immigrated and are learning a second language later in life. So all of those things come into play when we're thinking about this population. And all of these things together, not just one of these things, play into the disproportionate representation. And it really varies not only by state, but also by district and by school. And you can have either an overrepresentation where students from certain racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds are placed in special education at higher rates, or you can have an underrepresentation where students from racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds are not placed into special education at the same rates that we would expect them to see. So all of these things together are woven into this context that we're about to talk about. I don't know, Vanessa, if there's anything you wanted to add. Okay. So I'm going to start with the United States and the context and just the numbers. Then we're going to go into the Colorado context because we are at CO-CABE. And then we're just going to talk a little bit about the federal policies that are in place to support emerging bilingual students, as well as students that have disabilities. So in the United States, over 5 million students have the designation of emerging bilinguals. That's about 10% of the public school K through 12 population. From that percentage, about 11% of those students also have a disability designation under IDEA. If you could go to the next slide, B. And now we're going to zoom in on the Colorado context. And I got these from the state report card due to ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. Agencies are required to prepare and disseminate an annual state report. And so all this information comes from that. And it's really handy. It's found, like the sources are there and you can go look through different years. And I think as teachers, it's important that we also know how much the landscape has shifted. But that's just a good resource for you to have. So in the K-12 context, that's how many students there are in Colorado. And English learners, I will also use English learners because that is the terminology being used right here. So I just wanted to say that. Sometimes I'll go back and forth depending on which slide I'm looking at. English learners make up about 14% of the student population in Colorado. If you could go to the next slide, V. There are districts that have the highest numbers of EB. English learners are located throughout the state in 157 districts. 21 districts had more than 1,000 K-12 students enrolled at the time of this October snapshot. And the top 10 districts enroll more than 3,000 English learners. Denver County had the highest numbers of English learners, as you can see there, 30,000 English learners, followed by Adams-Arapahoe, which is more commonly known as Aurora Public Schools, and then the Adams 12. So these are the highest numbers of EBs. And then if we go to the next slide, we'll see districts with the highest percentages of EBs. And for 17 districts in Colorado, English learners represent at least 1/4 of their K-12 population. And the top 10, these districts had the top 10 percentages of students. Adams County had the highest percentages of EB, followed by Adams-Arapahoe. But we also see that there are some rural counties that do have high percentages of EBs. And I think that's important to consider in the Colorado context. It's not just the large urban centers. We also have some rural districts that do have large percentages or that have seen a population shift in their student population. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge, if you go to the next slide, V, that of those districts that have the highest populations, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 districts that are also under some sort of consent decree for not having met the needs of their emerging bilinguals. And I feel like these districts have come a long way, but we also need to acknowledge that they are under those consent decrees. And as teachers, we should know that, right? Adams 5, 12 Star in 2018, they settled a second out-of-court agreement with the Department of Justice to bring the district's English language program into complying. Westminster Public Schools is also under a 2018 out-of-court settlement agreement with the Department of Justice to ensure that students receive the support they need to succeed in the district's educational program. Denver County 1 in 2012 updated their consent decree between the Department of Justice, the Congress of Hispanic Educators, and Denver Public Schools. And it requires the district to implement comprehensive measures to ensure that ELs have equal opportunities to succeed academically in the districts and to make appropriate language services available for EL students who face unique challenges, including refugee students and students with disabilities. And Adams County 14, in 2014, there was a resolution agreement with the Office for Civil Rights after an investigation found the district guilty of harassment and discrimination against Spanish-speaking individuals. So although Colorado has come a long way, we need to be aware that these consent decrees are in place and really be vigilant and support our emerging bilingual students. So now that we talked a little bit about the emerging bilinguals in Colorado, I'm also going to give you some information and statistics about students with disabilities and then students with disabilities who also are emerging bilinguals. So the total population of students for 2018-2019 was 877,000, 125,000 or approximately 14% of those are English language learners, and students with disabilities of the total population in Colorado form about 10%. And if you could go to the next slide, Vanessa. Of the students with disability, about 15,000 of them, 15,751 are also EBs. So if we take a look at all of students with disabilities in Colorado, about 17% of them are also English learners. If you go to the next slide, yeah. This breaks down the disability categories by the various disabilities. This breaks down the bigger disability by various disability categories. And as you can see, most students in Colorado are either have the disability designation of specific learning disability, that's about 45%, or speech and language impairment, that's about 13% of students. And the next slide. And another really important thing to think about is that children with disabilities, given the federal legislation, spend most of their time inside a regular classroom, spend 80% or more. So 75.5% of students are in the regular classroom. That includes a bilingual classroom or a monolingual classroom in Colorado. So this idea that, oh, those are the special ed students, the special education teacher will work with them, doesn't actually apply. You as a general education teacher, if you are one, you'll have those students with you in your classrooms for the majority of the time, for at least 80% of the time. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the principles of IDEA and how they were also shifted and impacted by ESSA, but really keeping in mind that IDEA didn't come into play until 1975, when it was first established as the Education and Handicapped Act. But there are several principles that have been laid since then that are really important for us to remember. The first one is the zero reject. So all students are going to be given an education, and you can't reject a student based on a disability, because prior to 1975, this was not the case. If a student had a disability, they did not need to be part of an education system. So that ties into a free and appropriate public education, meaning that students are guaranteed this free and appropriate public education. But the word appropriate has come up in legislation, particularly in Colorado just recently, a couple of years ago in a Supreme Court decision that really thought about what does appropriate education mean and really meeting the needs of our students. The idea of a least restrictive environment, which sometimes is that their terminology is confusing, but what it is meant to say is that students with disabilities should participate in the general education classroom with their peers that do not have a disability designation for as much of the time as as they're able to, and be with peers for as much of the time. The idea of a non-discriminatory evaluation, so it students shouldn't be discriminated against in the evaluation process, say because they speak a different language or they have a different cultural background. And procedural due process, that we're taking time and following these steps, and we're not like pushing students off to the side and not getting these steps in place for them to have an IEP, and really having the input of parent and student participation. And the other thing that we really wanted to hone in on was that until IDEA, the legislation that sets this into place, the federal legislation, has been reauthorized several times. And in the 2000s, one of the reauthorizations talked about response to intervention model. Before that, the way that students were given a disability designation was really through an IQ discrepancy or a test discrepancy. So here is what typical students tend to score on this test. If your student score is below this, then this discrepancy, then yes, then they would be given a disability designation. But this model really, the federal government was actively trying to combat the disproportionality of students of color in special education. And so they thought this response to intervention model, where we are really looking at students, and Vanessa will go into more detail about this in a few slides, but I just wanted to set up the historical context of when it came into being. So it's not that long ago. It was in like 2004, I believe, that it really was put into place. And if you could go to the next slide. So IDEA sets up an individualized education plan, and it's really important that it's both a process and a legally binding document. It's a process through which students get a disability designation, but it's also a legally binding document. It is the plan that you're putting in place with the support of the parents and all the educational professionals. And it should have these components to it: the current level of educational performance, the measurable goals and measurable objectives and benchmark, any special education and related services, the extent of participation with non-disabled peers, a statement of how the child's progress will be measured and how parents will be informed of that progress, the extent of modification of participation in state and district-wide tests, and the dates and locations services to be provided, and any transition services once the child is, I believe, 15 or maybe earlier. But it's important to remember the history of Colorado around IEP, because the Douglas case, the Andrew case, who is a student with autism from Douglas County, I believe, really set up the stage for IEPs to not just be a minimum standard, but be really appropriately ambitious. And what does that mean for our students to have an IEP that's appropriately ambitious? We really want to challenge them and make sure that they are making as many gains as possible. If you could hit the next slide. So today we're really going to be focusing in on these two disability designations. There are 13 disability designations that students can be classified as, but we're focusing on specific learning disability or in speech or language impairment. And that is because that is the highest percentage of students. So you are more likely as an educator to see a student with this disability designation. They are also highly subjective. And we'll talk about that in just one second. So if you can go to the next slide. And we're going to take a second right now to read the definitions for these two high incidence disabilities, because it's important to recognize that as educators within this system of education that is racist, our biases play in, whether consciously or unconsciously. It's not like we're consciously thinking about these things, but they do play into these. And so a specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write well, or to do mathematical equations. And it can include dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, auditory processing disorder, or nonverbal learning disability. And just by reading it, we can see why students might be overrepresented in that category, right? In English, an emerging bilingual may have an imperfect ability to speak or write in English. And if they have not had a bilingual education or an education in the other language that they may speak, they may not be able to speak or write that other language in this idea that a bilingual might be a perfect bilingual, right? That you have equal abilities in both languages, which bilinguals do not tend to have equal abilities in both languages, because depending on what context they use their language in, they might have abilities for one thing and not another. And the same thing if we look at speech and language impairment, a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects a child's educational performance. It includes stuttering, a type of fluency disorder, and language impairments like difficulty comprehending words properly. So again, we can see the highly subjective nature of these two disabilities, and just keeping that on our forefront as we are thinking about as students are going through the referral process. I think, yeah. And so again, if we take a look, this is now back to not just Colorado, but the United States as a whole. These are the disability categories. In blue are emerging bilinguals, and in yellow are non-emerging bilinguals. So 48% of students that have the disability designation of specific learning disability are emerging bilinguals, and the same thing goes, and a higher percentage can also be seen in speech and language impairment, where 18% of emerging bilinguals are given that designation, as opposed to 16% of non. And in the other disability categories, we don't tend to see that disparity. So it's just an interesting thing to note and be aware of. And Vanessa is now going to talk about the multi-tiered system of support. So now that we have this context and these numbers, what does it mean to support our students in the classroom, since they are there for 80% of the time?
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a lot of information. So if you have questions, we definitely will have time at the end. But as we're talking, if you want to put something in the chat, just a clarification or a follow-up question, feel free to do that, either about Elizabeth's portion or what I'm going to get into now. So,
hey, Vanessa, I'm just going to jump in for a second so that you know that if you're watching through the app, there's a different question area, and somebody has posted a question. So I'm just going to read it to you so you know that it's there. It says, if a student has an LD or SLI, does it typically impact both languages?
Ooh, that's a good question. Elizabeth, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we would expect to see that across the languages that they speak. But we also have to be aware of our own biases, right? About what is a typical or what is standard language practice and what isn't standard. This idea of standard, right? Because there isn't a standard language if we talk to the linguist about it. But yes, we would expect to see similar things happening. So it's not like we're only going to be seeing this in English. We would expect to see it across languages. But there are differences, right? If a language is orthographically different, right? The way that Arabic might be to English, right? Then and for someone that might not see or know about the languages, it might not be as easy to see across, but we would expect them to see, and not just in English and Spanish, but across areas of their life.
Thanks for that question. Any others about what Elizabeth covered before I move on to RTI and MTSS? All right, so let's talk about response to intervention. And I'm going to kind of clarify the two terminologies that you'll hear me using, RTI and MTSS. But in response to intervention, the idea is that there is 3 tiers of systems of support to support our students who need something in addition to what is happening in your general education classroom. But this requires that that first tier, that general education classroom, is catered to meet all the diverse needs and learning styles that we see all the time. So it's high quality instruction, it's appropriate for the demographics in the classroom, and there's regular progress monitoring. That regular progress monitoring is so important, because if we're noting what we're doing and how students are responding, then we can see that there might be a few students who need something different. If all your students are struggling, then that means that instruction is not catered to your demographic of students and that the instruction needs to change. So I really like this model because the emphasis is not on first identifying what might be wrong, and I'm using air quotes here, with the student, but it really focuses on us as teachers examining our practices to see what we can do to provide high quality, meaningful instruction. So then you might have a few students who need a little bit extra. So we call that tier 2. It can still be in the general education setting. It can include small group interventions, either by the classroom teacher or by a special education teacher or an interventionist. It's more intensive and it's more targeted. But students who are receiving this tier 2, they don't have an individualized education plan. They haven't been referred to special education yet. So before we're assuming that a student has a disability, we're saying, okay, maybe we just need to target the support a little bit more for this population of students. If a student still isn't making that progress that we expect to see at their grade level, then we can refer them to tier 3 interventions. And that's more intensive. It can either be administered in a small group, it can be one-on-one. It is part of our special education process. It also can include things like related services, so occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is that we often hear RTI, which stands for response to intervention, and MTSS, which stands for multi-tiered systems of support, used interchangeably. And RTI is officially a subgroup of MTSS, and this also includes positive behavior support intervention. So things that focus on shifting a student's behavior in school, not so much their academics. But RTI is really focused on academics, and that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this presentation in the context of supporting emerging bilingual students. So we're going to draw on some examples from our teaching experience in New York City and show you what this looks like. What does RTI look like for a student who's dual identified as an emerging bilingual and has a disability? So in this New York City public school setting, this was a 3rd grade classroom, 24 students, 2 teachers. Elizabeth and I were both classroom teachers. And even though Elizabeth was designated as the general education teacher and I was the special education teacher, we worked collaboratively with all of our students. When you asked a student who their teacher was, they would say both of our names. There was no idea that I was the one to work with these students and Elizabeth was the one to work with these students. We collaborated and led different lessons and supported groups as we felt was appropriate for our schedule, for our students' needs, for our personalities, lots of things we've taken into consideration. 10 of our students had IEPs. I do think it's worth noting that in this 2-way immersion program that was mixed demographically in terms of students whose home language was English, students whose home language was Spanish, students who were white, students who were Latinx, that pretty much all of our students with IEPs were from Spanish-speaking Latinx families. But we taught half-time in English and half-time in Spanish. We did an alternating day model where one day was all in English and one day was all in Spanish. But as many of you know, this model will look different depending on your school's demographics and needs and language allocation policies. So let's focus on one student. This is a pseudonym for her. We'll call her Dana. She was an emerging bilingual student from a predominantly Spanish-speaking home. She lived with her mother, her grandmother, and they mostly spoke Spanish at home. She was a third grader and decoding at a first grade level in both languages. So that kind of speaks to the earlier question about the disability showing up in both languages. Her reading comprehension skills were at grade level. If I read a story out loud, if Elizabeth read a story out loud, if we had an audio version, she could implement all those higher order thinking skills that were appropriate for her grade level. However, the decoding was something that was below grade level. She was really strong with her oral skills in both languages, able to use the academic language that we had presented in a scaffolded way. Her handwriting and her organization of writing were really challenging to follow. In math, she would use counters and number charts to help her add one-digit subtraction and addition problems. So before I move on, I want to point out how I've phrased what Dana was like. I want you to notice that I used asset-based language. I didn't focus on what she couldn't do, where she was behind, what she was lacking. Instead, I'm focusing on what she's able to do. I'm not presenting a watered down version of what her abilities and her needs were, but I'm doing it in a humanizing way to honor what she was capable of doing as a third grader in our class. So what did RTI look like for Dana? In our general education classroom, by both of us, both Elizabeth and I, we did this for all of our students. This is part of the universal design for learning. We thought, okay, how can I present information in a way that lots of different students with different needs and different strengths are going to be able to process the information? So we would preview vocabulary and high frequency words before engaging in a reading task. We would provide different types of graphic organizers to the whole class that were really specific to the writing activity. So it wasn't just the general hamburger graphic organizer that we've seen. Instead, it was really specific to her. We created reading groups with students at similar levels, and this is where that collaboration really came into play. We worked with the other third grade teacher in the school so that our reading groups went across both classrooms. I know that that's challenging right now in COVID times because of the lack of ability to mix groups, but this was really beneficial because if we had students with similar needs, we could just do more by shifting them from one classroom to another for reading time. We had small group math activities, and sometimes Elizabeth would pull that small group while I would give the whole group instruction, and vice versa. We had lots of manipulatives that were always available to her, and we gave her lots of different strategies and her classmates lots of different strategies for solving math problems. So I'm seeing Fabiola says it's not reading comprehension if you read to her. And I think that you are referring to the idea that on standardized assessments, her scores in reading comprehension would still be low if she were not able to read the text herself, which I understand. And even with all of Dana's accommodations, she was allowed to have math problems on the math assessments read aloud to her. That was one of her IEP accommodations, but on reading exams, she wasn't allowed to, which I believe is very inequitable because reading comprehension means your ability to understand a text, and she was able to follow storylines. She was able to make connections to the characters, to make predictions, to show that she was making inferences. She was able to cite textual evidence. All those things are reading comprehension skills, but I understand your point that if she were tested using standardized assessments, she would not score high on those. Is that helpful, Fabiola? I'll let you chime in. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, it's okay. I think it's listening comprehension for me.
Yes.
But, listening comprehension, no reading comprehension.
If we were, so listening comprehension, she was able to follow instructions and things like that, but in a text, She would be able to follow the plot of the storyline. She would be able to make connections. She'd be able to do all these skills. But because it's unfair to categorize somebody as not understanding the text if they're not able to decode it. Those are just two different skills that we need to parse out. And the reason why that's helpful is because it targets the intervention. She didn't need help sequencing events of a story. She was really strong at that. What she needed help with was decoding a text. She needed accommodations to actually decode because of her learning disability, which was dyslexia.
Okay, thank you.
So in the second tier, we had a reading specialist and an interventionist who pulled Dana along with other students at similar reading levels. She did that twice a week and focused on that decoding, you know, kind of tapping out the words and using skills to help her be able to actually phonetically decode her reading, both in English and in Spanish. She was entitled to a scribe, a one-on-one support, which included scribing from a special education teacher or a general ed teacher. Sometimes even our student teacher did that, so that if she were going to show her response in writing, somebody could write it for her under certain circumstances. And she also had an occupational therapist that related service provider who suggested that she use a pencil grip. And this is really important. She didn't just hand us pencil grips and give them out to the students. She had to teach Dana how to use the pencil grip. It was something that she had to learn. Pencil grips on their own don't just magically support students' handwriting. It's a skill that needs to be taught and learned. And she also had modified word problems with visual aids. And I'm going to show you an example of what that looked like in math in a second. But then she also had an IEP. She had an IEP that had learning objectives based on her specific levels of performance. She had daily support between me or Elizabeth or a student teacher or an aide. There was always somebody to work with her one-on-one for reading and writing activities. And then again, the reason that she was able to receive occupational therapy was because she had that IEP. While the occupational therapist worked with us and gave us tips that we could try with lots of different students, that one-on-one support only came with the IEP. And I do think that it's important to highlight this because there's such a caution against over-identifying our students with special education labels. And while I really believe that students shouldn't need this document to receive the services that they're entitled to receive, the truth of the matter is that certain services will not be provided for students without this documentation. So we have to really think carefully about why we're referring a student to special education and what they will get that they wouldn't just get in the tier 1 and tier 2. Occupational therapy is one of those interventions. How did we know? I'm seeing Maida's question. How did you know it was dyslexia? This was something, so for a student to be diagnosed with, I think I'm going to ask that you just stay muted until it's your turn to talk, just because of the feedback with the different providers. But so dyslexia is not something that a teacher can diagnose. A teacher can see some signs for it. So some of the things that are signs of dyslexia were her handwriting at 3rd grade level is like one indication that a student might have dyslexia, but she went through the psychological testing from a school psychologist, from a series of assessments, and that's how she got the diagnosis. But it did happen at the school level, it just wasn't the teacher.
So I was just asking because I think we've had a student with kind of like the similar things that you're talking about, but it's been like the communication that as our SPED teachers cannot diagnose dyslexia. So then I was just wondering, just before she goes on to middle school, that I know it's short time now, but maybe we take the appropriate, I don't know, steps into trying to get her tested for that before she continues, because everything that you said is aligned to all of the things. And yes, she's receiving that tier 1 and tier 2 intervention, but you know, those tier 3 interventions will definitely support her.
I think about this all the time, and my dissertation actually focused on the RTI process in a 5th grade dual language classroom. And there's that tension. I didn't want to see students diagnosed if they didn't need it, but then I worried, what does that mean as they transition to middle school? Is she going to get those supports that she needs without that IEP? So I personally don't think there's one blanket answer. There's no right or wrong blanket statement here, but considering what she might need and that documentation that will follow her to middle school, it sounds like it might be worth considering a referral.
Yeah, we've been going through the MTSS process. I mean, since she was in 2nd grade, and it's just like she never has met the qualifications for, you know, whatever falls under those 13 things. So she has a 504 plan. So that's why I'm just like, where do we move this next? Or like what provider in our district or even within our building to move this ahead? You know?
Yeah, she's been tested. She's gone through the referral process and
she's gone through the referral process multiple times, and I don't know, I guess I'm not sure exactly if she's gotten tested. I know now she has a 504 plan, but for whatever reason doesn't meet the requirements. And because they don't test for dyslexia, like that assessment that they give doesn't test for dyslexia, she doesn't have an IEP, she just has a 504 plan.
Well, the 504 plan should still also be a support with her, and maybe that will be enough. And then the other thing, and I do think this is like one area that we can improve on, is like communication between the elementary school and the middle school, just to like have there be some communication, and then also to teach our students, our kids, to be advocates for themselves and to recognize, and her parents, and to make sure that she knows what kind of differentiated items that she needs and accommodations that she needs, and how she can advocate for that when she enters middle school.
Yeah, because I mean, it's really low decoding skills, like everything that you're saying. But her like she's able to comprehend really well and speak to that orally and stuff. If something's read to her, she could tell you and identify all those comprehension skills. So that's why I was wondering, like, do I reach out to the psychologist, or is there like Children's Hospital or something that they would have to go get tested with parent consent? Because then that's another thing, right? I guess parents' mentality about having to label their children. So, and sometimes it's not, you know, because they're not informed or whatever. We've been having an issue, I know, particularly with this mom. So
I think also, I just wanted to add that for this student, she ended up having also some visual things with her eyes. And so once they did a more comprehensive, both physical and the whole battery of assessments, then they were able to really pinpoint that. But that really comes from parent support. And if parents really start noticing and also talk to their pediatrician and other service providers, then they can get that battery of tests. So if a parent asks for a complete evaluation, then that should happen under law. And so that is also really important for you as teachers, because as teachers, we only have certain leverage, I guess is the word I want to say. And we don't know, like I cannot diagnose dyslexia. I can see, like what Vanessa said, I can see these things happening. So really forging a partnership with the other service providers and the school psychologists, so we can get a complete picture of the student's abilities, or right. So it might be a visual tracking thing in her reading. And there's lots of reasons why we see these behaviors, but we won't know until we have a full evaluation. Right, we hope that helps, but it gets very, very
yeah, I was just hoping, like, if that form of evaluation goes outside, you know, like the SPED assessments that we were talking about earlier and stuff. And
I must be honest, it does vary by state. So I'm much more familiar with New York City and New York State guidelines. So I can't speak to the which different assessments are done specifically in Colorado. I must say that is true.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Maida. I want to show you this example of a differentiated math problem because I want you to be able to walk away with some tools that you might be able to try in your classroom or support the teachers that you work with. So thinking again about what Dana in particular needed, and I want to highlight that I didn't just create this for Dana. Even though Dana is our focal student here, there were a lot of students in the classroom that benefited from having these types of differentiated supports in their math problems. So the original math problem that was taken from our math curriculum and really focused on types of questions students would see on assessment said that Juan's father gave him a quarter, 2 dimes, and a nickel. How much more money does he need to get to $1? Show your work. So that's the math problem here. Look at all the cognitive demands in this math problem. They have to remember how much a quarter is worth, how much a dime is worth, how much a nickel is worth. They have to add all those values together. Then they have to subtract those values from $1, remembering that $1 is also the equivalent of 100 cents. There's so much there in this very, I'm going to use quotes, air quotes again, simple math problem. So what did we need? Okay, maybe remembering all the names of these coins, especially for a student who's navigating this in 2 languages, that vocabulary might be a challenge. So let's put those coins there as a reminder that a penny, this is what it looks like, this is what its value is. And then we're going to say, this is how much money Juan's father gave him. So it's the same content, but it's a different process of seeing the content. I'm showing you the coins. So how much money is that all together? So now Dana is able to say like, okay, 1 quarter plus 2 dimes plus a nickel, add that together. How much more does he need to get to $1? Show your work. You can use a number line. So I'm reminding the students of the tools that they have in order to get to that problem. We have the number line that's 100 and we can have that visual there and then she can count and figure this out. So we're providing the scaffold, we're providing the support so that the content is not watered down. It's the same content, but it's scaffolded in a way that's appropriate for our students. Here's an example of a differentiated literacy task that we would do. So we would read Rainbow Crow, which is a tale of how the crow started off as this rainbow feathered bird with a beautiful voice and ended up as this black crow with a scratchy voice and a bird that nobody hunts or wants to capture. And it's an Iroquois tale. So this related to our social studies curriculum in which we were studying the indigenous people of the land we now call New York. And we read this story out loud with all of our students. So this is an example of what the text looked like on the page. And this was an activity that was centered around this, again, in preparation for the grade level writing task that they had to do. So the objective is that the students have to describe how the main character changed throughout the story. So first, like I said, we previewed the vocabulary. We chose the words that the students would need to know in order to understand the text. We gave them the context from the book. So we're getting their brains ready or getting them activated and prepared to engage in this specific text by pulling out those words. We talk about the parts of speech, we use the context, and then we have students document what this word means so that they have this resource available to them. Then we modified the text. We scanned some of the photos, we typed up the text, and different students had different versions of the text. Some of them had verbatim what was typed in the book. Others had modified versions that perhaps had fewer vocabulary words that were challenging to them or simpler sentence structures. And again, this is where collaborating with our other 4th grade teacher or 3rd grade teacher and our student teacher helped make this possible so that it was a resource we could use across the classes. And then we had writing scaffolds. So we asked students, ooh, I don't know where that's coming from. Somebody's writing on it. Anyway, we had students use words from the question to write their answer. And then, thank you, Sue. And then we had them talk about how Rainbow Crow felt after an event in the book, and then at the end of the story. So we're asking them to kind of pull out those main ideas from different sections of the story to form a written response. Elizabeth also has an example. I see that we're running a little low on time, and I really love this question that was asked on the app. Thank you, Jill. Hope to see you soon. how do you manage meeting a student's IEP minutes as well as language development support so they're not being pulled out of the classroom for the majority of the day or missing it? So we've highlighted this as an example of the collaboration and why that's so important for MTSS and RTI. We had our service providers push into the classroom all the time so that students didn't feel like they were being pulled out, that they were being pulled away, that it's less stigmatizing. We worked with our speech therapist to make sure that we were working on the same skills. And when we had those book groups in the beginning of our day, sometimes the speech therapist was there with a group of her students, sometimes bringing a student from another class, and working on the same types of activities, but more targeted to meet those needs. So having those service providers work with you and come into the classroom, it takes a little bit more time management and planning than a lot of us have the time for, but in the end, it saves everybody time because it's just more people working with your students. Elizabeth, do you want to share this? I'm noticing the time, or do you want to?
No, I actually think that we should get to the CLD stuff.
Okay.
But Myra, I just did a very quick search about dyslexia in Colorado, and apparently there was a bill that was signed recently about dyslexia. I haven't been able to really look at it because I just Googled it just now, but the CDE apparently also has a page on dyslexia. So I'm just going to copy and paste it into the chat, and I'm going to do a little bit more research myself, but it seems that it's a topic that has been in Colorado.
Thank you.
So just thinking about the types of things that make this RTI work for students. And again, I have that collaboration that is so key, but also I want to talk about the importance of culturally and linguistically sustaining teaching at all 3 tiers. So we often hear culturally responsive teaching, and it's like a catch-all term these days, but I want to just highlight some things that emphasize what makes it culturally and linguistically sustaining for our emerging bilingual students. So one is the student-centered instruction. So having students be able to make explorations and discoveries on their own and connect to their lived experiences, acknowledging and celebrating all cultures, especially the ones in your classrooms, but also beyond. And then using those cultural references in all aspects of our learning, not just adding this on at the tail end of a lesson. And that we recognize that learning to read and write in a second language is similar in some ways, but also different and distinct from reading and writing in a first language. And understanding what our students are able to do in both languages. And then this is key, including language objectives and language supports, and development of linguistic competence through purposeful classroom dialogue and frequent opportunities to learn and use academic language. The language instruction has to be explicit. We cannot just assume that students will pick up on the type of academic concepts and words and phrases that we want them to use just by being present in our classroom. We have to explicitly teach it to them, and that includes being really clear about what the objective is for that lesson, what we want them to say or write or listen to or read. So those language supports will look different depending on the proficiency levels of your students, the language allocation policy in your setting. But we know that providing instruction in the home language as well as ESL supports is really beneficial for students who are navigating 2 languages, including those who have disabilities. There's often a common misconception that teaching a student with a disability in 2 languages will be an added burden and confusing, and that is not the case. These students in particular benefit from having instruction in their home language. We want to purposefully develop their vocabulary, scaffold the storytelling, have repetitive language and routine so they see it over and over and it becomes ingrained in part of their everyday vocabulary. And we want to give students chances to speak with one another, to talk, to interact, and to listen and to respond. And we have to explicitly model it, both in what we say and do, but also with the text that we use, highlighting how texts are models for what we want our students to write. I'm noticing the time, so we are over. I do want to just highlight the importance of using books that are are really purposeful in your culturally and linguistically sustaining teaching. So using books that kind of talk about the political and social experiences of our students.
Vanessa, you have till 10:30.
I know we wanted to leave time for questions. So maybe I'll just.
Okay, sorry. I just didn't, was like, you still have 15 minutes.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through these in like the next 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll still have some time for questions. Is that, Lucy, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, questions have been throughout, and so there is no need to have that, 15-minute block at the end. So take your time. I think this is important content.
Okay. So I really want us to be thinking about the books that we choose, and being able to provide books that speak to the lived experiences of our students and that address things that are central to their lives. So when we're teaching in bilingual settings, we often have more students than in a monolingual setting who are immigrants or children of immigrants and experiencing the realities of immigration in a way that is unique to them. And to ignore it is to deny what is central to so many of their lives. So books like From North to South talk about the undocumented experience, and not only talk about it, but portray the story in a humanizing way, offering what is often called a counter story to the dominant stories that they're hearing from the government and their leaders and policies that are inhumane. So these are some of my favorite books: Gabby Lost and Found and Esperanza Rising for older kids. I know that Esperanza Rising is part of the 5th grade curriculum for those of you using expeditionary learning. And the other thing that I love about Gabby Lost and Found and a lot of these books is that other publishers, including Scholastic, have pulled out excerpts from it so that if you are working with students in Tier 1 and Tier 2, you can use some of their resources and target those reading interventions, but using the text that they're already using in their classroom. So they have another way to engage in these grade level texts, but in a way that is scaffolded and focused on their specific learning needs. The same thing with language and literacy in schooling. We want to provide books that show authentic uses of 2 languages. There's not a need to keep the languages strictly separated. So these are some books that highlight examples of translanguaging, that honor bilingualism, that celebrate bilingualism. And we want to make space for students to use their home language as a resource as well. I know that translanguaging is a big buzzword these days, and I want to emphasize that it's not something that we want to implement randomly. Instead, we want to think really purposefully of how we're going to not only model the use of our home language to support our understanding of something in a target language, but how we want to make space and encourage students to do the same. And then, so I talked about this. These are, again, some of my favorite books that, again, talk about immigration. And what you could do is you could have the topic of immigration be something that is a theme, and then create reading groups or book clubs so that students are reading texts that are at their specific grade level, but everybody's able to engage in topics about this sociopolitical topic together. So these are some books. Some of them are available bilingually, some of them English and Spanish versions. Some of them talk about immigration from people from Mexico, or Island Born is from the Dominican Republic, and Behind the Mountains is a Haitian story. So we wanted to just ask you before you leave to kind of just jot down one idea of instruction where you could maybe apply some of these approaches. Thank you. Yes, I'll pull that up again too, just in case you want to. Elizabeth and I have to talk about sharing this slide deck, but in the meantime, if you want to take a screenshot of this, you're welcome to. And then we are wrapping up now, so I will leave a few. Right, Elizabeth? Can we wrap up now and see if there are any questions?
Yes, I think there are some things about pictures of students that I have in there that we have to take out before we share. But I think we can make the majority of it available.
Yeah. So yes. So we just encourage you to continue these conversations and explore your setting, thinking about what can be improved, thinking about the patterns of disproportionate representation if it's there. And then the big thing that we really want you to think about is just how you can apply these concepts of RTI. So.
I just also put in the
the chat, there's a website called bookshare.org. And if your student has certain IEP classifications, then they are able to get audiobooks and different books for free through that app. So if you yourself are a special education teacher, or you can give it to a person in your school that does have that license, then you can sign up specific students or classrooms of students to use that app. You just have to make sure that they fit the qualifying classification. And I believe they have books in Spanish. I don't remember, but that was something that I think is important, just a resource to share. But yeah, we will take more questions if you have them.
Do you mind if I come off mute and just ask a follow-up question to the one about minutes between IEPs and language development?
Yes.
So I guess like my challenge at my school has just been in general with like the federally mandated amount of minutes and how like English language development, you know, is supposed to be 45 minutes of dedicated language instruction, which, you know, in as I understand it, is supposed to be pull out. And then the IEP minutes, like I'm not expert with that, but I believe those can be a little bit more flexible maybe, but that then there are maybe some dedicated minutes that are supposed to be pull out. And so just with the limited amount of time in the day, like how can you really balance all those minutes that are supposed to be met and still make sure that students are part of the classroom? And like, I don't know, I don't know whether there's a good answer, and I understand your idea of like collaboration, but does that work with federally mandated minutes?
I think it does. I think it depends. It's hard to speak broadly. So it depends on the individual student and their individualized education plan. I do think that in that case, in many ways, IEPs are more flexible because you as a team are writing in. It isn't like a set standard that I am aware of. It could have changed since I've been out of the classroom. So I just want to make that caveat too. But I'm pretty sure it can be very flexible in that sense. But also thinking that things that we could be doing two things at once depending on what that specific skill is. So they might be in a push-in program with their speech language therapist, and so that would count as speech language therapy if in their IEP it says in a group of 3 or 4, and that is happening within the classroom. So really thinking about how we're, yeah, it's hard. I do recommend, there's this special education considerations for English language learners, developing a continuum of services, and they have several different charts and tools to use as you are developing an IEP and how to keep in mind both the language and special education needs for students. But I think the beauty of the IEP is that it is very much a document that you and the family and the school can create together and shape it to really be beneficial for the student.
Okay,
but it's hard also. I want to acknowledge how hard it is.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the recommendation for the book.
Diane, did you have a comment that you wanted to share?
Sorry, I didn't mean to put that in there, but I do actually have a comment when you were talking about the importance of, using the primary language in the home and bilingualism. And I've just had a lot of parents tell me that their pediatricians, when their student is struggling, tell them stick with English, only, speak English in the home. And so I'm just really wondering if there's like some maybe education that we can do for pediatricians or doctors where they can realize the value of that bilingualism, multilingualism. So.
Yes,
It's-
you are. There is no empirical evidence, and I'm going to say this many times, and I will link some articles on it. Bilingualism, in the research that has been done, which isn't a lot, but it's growing, there's no empirical evidence that learning two languages causes a disability or aggravates a disability. Students that are bilingual can be bilingual and have a disability. It is not mutually exclusive. And we have seen studies of kids that are multilingual and have disabilities. There has been some really interesting studies about kids with autism that speak several languages like Arabic and Hindi and English, because those languages form part of who they are and meet certain social needs. And actually for students with autism, we see less behaviors and less sometimes kids with autism can have trouble communicating, and that gets aggravated once they are told that they can only use one language. And so it helps them actually to communicate by being able to use their full linguistic repertoire. But you're right, this is a new area, and this is something that is new for pediatricians. For many speech language pathologists still make this recommendation. For many teachers, both monolingual and bilingual teachers still have this misconception that students that have disabilities should not be placed in bilingual programs. And it really comes from this idea, or this not knowing about the way that language develops and how we do have one linguistic repertoires in our brains. And what bilinguals are doing is either activating or repressing certain language features at a time. And that can be seen very, very, very early on. And it can also be seen once you are no longer speaking that language. So they've been doing studies with kids that were internationally adopted. So they spoke one language at birth, actually it was Chinese, and then they were moved to French speaking countries and they no longer use that language. But when they looked at brain scans, that other language was still activated when they spoke. So it's really cool and interesting to see. But it goes across. It's not just pediatricians, it's also teachers, it's also the education system. And it comes with lots of different things, right, that we talked about, the confluence of things that happens.
And I just, as somebody who teaches family and community engagement courses, this is where I think talking, like having some sort of education for pediatricians would be so amazing. And I'm going to pin that and think about that as a future opportunity. I also would encourage you to think about your school and what type of education and collaboration you can include with the family and community to kind of encourage parents to advocate for themselves in this situation respectfully. And it can just be as simple as sharing some language. Like, what do you do when your pediatrician says this? And you could say, I respect your medical opinion so much. The research that's been shared with me and that I've done shows that this is actually not the case. And, you know, citing some of those examples of what children internationally do might be helpful.
I also want to bring up the point that for many parents, not all parents, but for some parents, and particularly if they are immigrant parents, this message of like English and my child needs to learn English is very prevalent, right? We can see that by parents not signing up their children for bilingual programs and forgoing English language acquisition support, right? And so that also needs to be acknowledged, that this is also prevalent for many communities, and we should be having a discussion about it, right? And I can understand that, right? In this idea that in the United States, you need English to do well. So yes, I want my child to do well. And oh, more time speaking English would lead to more time for them to become proficient in English. Like I could see why that misconception is there. So also acknowledging that and talking with parents about that.
Well, we are out of time, but as you can see, we could talk about this forever. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sue. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Madeline, for sharing a resource. We really appreciate all the hard work you're all doing in schools and classrooms, and we appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us.
Yes.